Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by the legendary Jan Hammer. On today's episode, we will cover some of his career highlights and, of course, also discuss his latest album called Seasons Part 2. It is my great pleasure to welcome Jan Hammer.
Hello, it's my pleasure to join you.
Jan, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. And Jan, at first, I would like to talk about your early days. Which of your early work or albums in general would you encourage younger fans to check out, and why?
I guess the breakthrough point for me would be the album First 7 Days, which was the my first real solo, album as a solo artist, and it's full of signs of what's to come, in the future after in the rest of my musical career and life. So that album, First 7 Days, is definitely pretty much a touchstone. I'm very, very proud of that one.
You have covered so much ground. You have done solo albums, you have released albums under the Jan Hammer group, then there was Hammer, and also, of course, the Mahavishnu Orchestra. I hope I pronounced it correctly. So we are talking about jazz music, about jazz rock fusion, and about electronic music. Do you have a favorite musical genre which you feel closest to?
I would have to say it's the one that I'm doing now.
Haha.
Every time I do something else, that is my favorite for the time, and I explore it, and then I move on to further explorations. And obviously, I was in parallel path with the development of electronic music from the 60s, with the first Moog synthesizers, all the way to what's happening now, where the musical instruments actually live in the computer itself, and they're all basically virtual instruments, and you can model just about anything from the past and hopefully for the future.
You are a synthesizer virtuoso, basically. And I would like to talk about, at least briefly, the difficult aspect behind programming and actually playing. I mean, there have been synthesizers which have been, as I understand, tremendously difficult instruments to program, especially back in the day. What can you tell me about that?
Well, back in the day, it was free for all. Everybody's on their own. So you had to basically go and trial and error. When I got my first synthesizer, I brought it to my apartment in New York City, plugged in my headphones, and started experimenting, and just continuously started blowing my mind that the sound, this was like something I've never heard before. There's something that I couldn't even imagine. That's how it struck me when I first started playing. And as far as using it as a solo instrument in a context of a band, what was important to me was that I was able to shape the melody in a totally different way than from a piano, where I was actually able to bend and do bends and slides like the same way that a violin or a guitar could do, and which piano didn't have. And that was, to me, that was the fantastic change that pointed to my future and gave me my new voice.
Great. Thank you very much, Jan, for elaborating on that. And how would you describe the Jan Hammer sound and your approach towards music? What is Jan Hammer in a nutshell?
Haha.
Haha.
Now you need a big nut. uh, Holy mackerel. I think it's music as a most abstract form, at the same time being able to express things that cannot be said. It's songs without words to me, even though sometimes you add words later, but the basic layer where I exist and work is now it's probably called something like a pop instrumental with classical influence. and combined somehow. So that is the secret of my approach.
Ah, great, Jan. And I know you have great touring experience. I mean, you have performed so many live gigs. How would you describe performing a live gig and the energy and the creative freedom it creates?
It can be pretty frightening if you let it scare you, but once you actually get going, it's very similar to levitating. You're like, you leave the ground and just float on the layers of music. I may sound too cosmic or crunchy granola, but that's basically what it did to me. And it all comes down to in the live, especially in the live situation, to improvisation, where there is you play some music and then there is a space for you to go completely off on your own and improvise. And that to me is probably my favorite part of live performance.
Okay, great. And Jan, I have found an interesting quote online, and I'm not sure if they paraphrased it or if it's an exact quote. It says, if I ever had to re-record some piece of music which I did in the 70s, it would be a nightmare today. How so?"
That's right. I wouldn't even know where to begin, as because the equipment has evolved in so many different stages now. The iterations of synthesizers and recording techniques, you know what I mean? And the reason the records sounded the way they did was part of the limitations on all the equipment and recording. And as everything evolved, it would be almost impossible to recreate something exactly like it sounded. I don't see how that could be done, and I don't even see why I should do it. I think the recordings that I did then stand on their own, and that's fine with me.
Okay, the next question may be difficult to answer, or it may sound generic at first, but what do you attribute the success of your career to?
I have to. I know it may sound funny, but I do have some sort of talent, and that's major part that you have to have. But then you also have to be lucky and run into the right people at the right time and connect. And between those two things, I think that you got it made if you can cover those two prerequisites.
Yes, I mean, that's interesting because many people, I think, would share this sentiment because luck is a major factor, and of course, talent and hard work. And I mean, being at the right place at the right time.
Definitely, that for instance, that's how it worked out with Miami Vice. It was a combination of where electronic music was in the early '80s, where people like, I guess, Tangerine Dream and so on, Kraftwerk, and Giorgio Moroder was doing some of that, and I was basically right at the right moment, exploring the same territory. And I through a friend I met with Michael Mann, the big Michael Mann, the producer, executive producer of Miami Vice, and he was looking for some music for the show that didn't sound like anything else on television. So I played him a couple of sketches that I had, and he said, "Well, let's go with that." And that one of those pieces actually was the theme, the Miami Vice theme, which became number one everywhere.
Miami Vice was released in 1984 and you scored 90 episodes, if I'm not mistaken, so basically 4 out of 5 seasons. Would you consider Miami Vice to be a major turning point in your career?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, the career combined with breakthrough in, again, the most advanced electronic music at the time, plus being, I guess, successful in a sense that you are rewarded. Things like you get paid a lot better and you get Grammy awards and things like that. And number one Billboard Top 100, that's not nothing to sneeze at.
Most certainly not. I mean, it was basically your big breakthrough also in the United States in 1984, and the album sold millions of copies. You earned 2 Grammys for it, I think for Best Pop Instrumental Performance and also for Best Instrumental Composition. So that speaks volumes, and that's a huge achievement. So, and I would like to ask you about working with Michael Mann. He was one of the executive producers, and was he one of the key players behind the scenes and your main collaborator or decision maker? Would you say he was just as let's say involved as every director?
Well, my experience with Michael was completely different from anybody else who ever worked with him, because he, as far as hands-on and deeply involved in the process, he is one of the most hands-on people in the industry. But for some reason, when we got picked up for series, we did the pilot, the first 2-hour episode, and then we got picked up to run as a series on NBC. He just told me, I want you to just go ahead and run with it. And I said, what do you mean? It's just, you come up with something and you spot it, you put it where you want it. Basically, he left me alone. The only suggestion that I've ever heard in the 4 years was, give me some more music. And that was it. There was no creative pressure or nothing over analyzing, from week to week. I mean, it was kind of breathtaking load of work, to put out an episode of fresh music every week. But he left me alone, and that's why I was able to do it.
Great. I mean, so basically you had complete artistic freedom, to put it that way.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it when it was happening, but I said, hey, I'll take it.
You just said something which I think is very important also in terms of, other Michael Mann collaborations. I think many people would be surprised to hear that you had complete artistic freedom, because I know that Michael has been described as a pretty hands-on filmmaker, and a, let's say, quote unquote difficult collaborator. I mean, I've heard that so many times that he is so specific and that he changes things on the fly constantly, even to the last minute before the dub. So
no, we had that happen with him a couple of times, sure, where everything was finished. It was even after the dub, after there was a print ready to go, and he would go and edit the mixed, do some, my last second changes, which kind of was, I felt kind of brutal and inelegant. But, he is a Michael Mann, so what are you going to say?
Yes, absolutely. Nowadays, Jan, everything is about technology, and the field of technology has seen so much development. And I know that today it's a given to send an email and to share a piece of music, via email, and so many people can listen to it instantly and incessantly. But back then, of course, it was a whole different story. So basically, whenever you wrote something, a courier basically had to pick up the material, because you live in New York, right? And so they had to pick up the material, deliver it to the filmmakers or the series director, and then they went from there, and then you would get the feedback.
And no, there was no time for that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if that was what really saved my life, because if I were to deal with feedback, it really helped not being in LA where the post was done. Yeah, the show was filming in Miami and posting in LA. And so what happened was, a courier would bring me the almost finished cut on video. I would watch it once, and as I watched it, I jotted down ideas pretty much into the already, I started already recording as I was watching it, because I didn't know the story, and I really liked that. Not reading the script. I got caught up in the in the excitement and the drama, and I was able to respond as a regular person. I don't know if that makes any sense,
It does.
but it but it influenced the way I worked. Anyway, so that would take like 2 or 3 days. I would record everything, mix it, and send the audio tape via courier again to the sound editor in LA. And and then we would talk. I would just tell him, I would send him the spotting notes, the placement, and timings, the time code and all that. And that was it every week after week.
And thank you very much for elaborating on that. And before we talk a little bit more about Miami Vice, the series, I would like to ask you whether or not you had expressed interest in scoring the actual movie directed by Michael Mann, which I think was released in 2006.
Yeah, that is a kind of a sore spot.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean there was no communication. I did not express. I mean, I felt I didn't have to express, but I would have liked to have been asked or suggested for some part in making that movie version, but nobody called. Nobody. I didn't hear anything, and I guess they thought maybe they could all go much more modern than me, and it didn't really happen that way.
I mean, I'm sorry to hear that, and of course,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to I didn't mean to bring up a sore subject. I was just curious, but thank you for answering it anyway. I hope I didn't.
No, no. It's a long. It's too much Dom Perignon under the bridge.
Okay, thank you, Jan. And I'm also curious as to how you produce the albums. If I am informed correctly, and if I calculated correctly, there have been 6 albums featuring Miami Vice music, including a best of, including the original albums, including the complete collection, which featured 2 CDs. So there's a lot going on, musically speaking, in the Miami Vice universe. And as I understand, you also had to go back and watch several episodes and then kind of subsequently use your 80s equipment in order to re-record many pieces. Am I on the right track here?
Oh yes, that it was the equipment is something that from the 80s I still have. To try to do something from the 70s or 60s, that would be really much harder. But yeah, that is correct. Yeah, that's what I did.
I'm sure many fans are also curious, will there be another definitive edition of Miami Vice for those who missed the other albums in the past?
Well, for those people, I keep getting emails, from different fans, and they keep mentioning snippets of music from obscure episodes that I already forgot about, and I'm sure that if I re-recorded and put them out, then they would say, "But what about that one?" I don't think there can be a definitive version or album because there was so much disparate pieces of music, and not all of them can lend themselves to treatment for full length album cuts.
Yes. So, I mean, I'm sure you cannot please everybody, and I think you could release probably many more volumes and still find something which hasn't been released, or you could give it a once over and release a new version of it. I mean, let's say so many pieces of music are or have been so iconic, and allow me to say that Miami Vice features some of the most iconic music ever written for television. There's no question about it. I mean, the Miami Vice theme itself is so iconic, but I think, to me personally, I think Crockett's theme may be in my top 5 of the most well-known and best pieces of music for television, and I don't think I would be the only person to say that.
Yeah, thank you. I love it. I love that piece very much. I knew that it was special when it came to me, and I was hoping that people would hear it. It didn't really click over here in the United States for some reason. We just couldn't get it through. But I remember all over Europe, England, Holland was crazy. That was just beautiful. I remember walking around in Amsterdam, and I could hear it coming out of windows. It was just a phenomenal feeling.
It's such a great piece of music, and so many people who basically know very little about TV music or about film music, they are familiar with that piece of music. You know, a friend of mine, talks to me about this piece of music every time, or basically several times each year, and he plays it a lot. So he keeps going back to Miami Vice, and he mentions Jan Hammer and Crockett's theme from the '80s. So that's that piece, I think, in itself is a major legacy.
Yeah, no, it definitely feels that way to me.
Before we talk about seasons, is there anything else about your work for television or for films per se which you would like to mention? Something that stands out as a landmark in your career?
I don't know. I think it's hard to compete with with Miami Vice as far as sheer impact and scale of the impact that the show had. Anything else that I've done, I've worked on a whole bunch of different shows, and there's all kinds of music that I'm very proud of, but nobody really, they never made it, as far as ratings, television success. So it's not really comparable. But as far as the definitive version of Miami Vice, I mean, I'm pretty close between Seasons Part 1 and Seasons Part 2. There are pieces of music that are, I think, direct outgrowth of the whole evolution that I went through in Miami Vice, and now with new instrumentation. And I would imagine that if this was set to some imaginary TV show, that it would probably work just like Miami Vice did. So I don't see that as much different from then till now, but because I think it's a connecting line that goes through all of that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jan. And now I would love to talk about seasons. 2 albums have been released so far. The first one in 2018, and now 3 days ago, volume number 2. And you basically have returned after a, let's say, hiatus. And the break, I think, paid dividends as you got rave reviews for Seasons Part 1. I mean, such as, rarely have the breathtaking evocation of endless vistas and the glorious traditions and styles of classical and contemporary music come together so gloriously. I mean, that reads like a love letter, basically.
Well, that's basically what it felt like when I did it. I mean, I couldn't describe the ideal that I have in my head when I work on it. Was pretty much what the review said. So that made me very happy.
Right. And Jan, I would like to talk about the idea behind those 2 concept albums. What was the main reason and idea behind those?
Well, I live in nature, in basically in the woods just north of New York City. And I'm in nature all the time, surrounded by it. And I see how endangered it is, how fragile, and how downhill it has been going, especially since we started ignoring all the signs like 20, 30 years ago. And we are now talking about doing something, with climate change. It's I hate to say too late. It's too late to change anything right now, because we are now stuck with the disaster that's upon us. And I don't want to be like a doomsday talker, but a lot of the music, as far as I'm concerned, came out from the feeling of that some hope has to show up somewhere. I cannot be this despondent.
Yes, and that's very well put. And I think we are now basically paying the price for having treated the environment poorly for so many years. And I think it's devastating. But
And it's not like we haven't been told.
Yes.
You know, how many years people were making fun of Al Gore. And Jesus Christ, if 30 years ago, if we started doing something, how much different it could have been. So that a lot of it, a lot of these thoughts and feelings were the background inspiration for both albums, and it just, yeah, it carries on in this one.
Yes, and you're absolutely right, Jan. Thank you for elaborating on that. And as I mentioned before, you're right out of New York, your New York based home studio, which I think is called Red Gate Studios. And I would think that it's a major benefit to have the right studio in the right environment with the right surroundings in order to feel comfortable, in order to, let's say, get the creative juices going in order to come up with a concept album such as Season. So I think that was a major benefit.
Oh, definitely. But what's interesting is that I've uh, I've been here, I've lived here close to 50 years. So when I mentioned my first album that I was so proud of, First 7 Days, that was the first album I recorded here in the same space. And that was like 48, 47 years ago. And you are right. It's amazingly conducive to go, and explore your feelings and on a relationship with nature.
Did you actually take long walks during the writing process so you can basically also recharge your musical battery, so to speak?
I don't think it was in with that intent in mind. Like, it wasn't, I have to walk now to come up with something. But, I walk and I see a hill or, meadow or forest, and bang, there is an idea right there. So I go back home and I record it.
Did you most of the time, let's say, think about certain seasons such as summer and try to come up with a musical equivalent, or do you just, write and see where it takes you for the most part?
Yeah, basically, I think the music, for the most part, the musical pieces come first, and then as you put them in a row, figure out this one goes to that. You realize that this might be something to do with summer, something to do with winter, and so on. So I don't think I would describe it that I had an outline to work on seasons, like Vivaldi.
Hmm.
But more or less, the name sort of came a little bit later and made it into a neat collection of music.
Would you consider this work or those two albums to be an extension of your previous work and maybe also a new kind of genesis?
All of the above. Yeah, it's some sort of a combination of my first album and where my head is right now. I can see it like a sort of a circle being completed.
Will there be Seasons Part 3?
No,
No.
the whole idea was part one and part two. That's it. It whatever whatever comes next, I don't know, but it won't be part three. That's superfluous.
Oh, okay. So basically, you've told everything there is to tell with those two.
Yeah, I don't know if I told everything there is to tell, but I I just wouldn't feel right to try and milk a concept that far.
I would like to briefly talk about your synth work. I mean, as I understand, you've worked plenty of times using the Fairlight and also the Moog. And what do those synthesizers offer in terms of sounds, in terms of the possibility to explore sounds? Why would you go for those two instruments, for instance?
Well, basically, at the time that I used those two were the most advanced examples of their kind, of the of the Moog, which with its incredible sound, and it was polyphonic and it was programmable, and it you could store the programs into presets, which was an incredible development at the time. So that's for the memory Moog, and Fairlight was the first practical version of a very advanced sampler, where you actually sample acoustic sounds into it and then manipulate and combine them. So between those two, I was really able to do most of the production.
And Jan, I know you said you didn't know what lies ahead, but would you consider touring through Europe, for instance, to perform your most well-known pieces, or to also incorporate seasons, or to, let's say, perform some jazz pieces? Have you considered that?
That is not going to happen. I've basically had it with live performances for a long, long time.
Okay.
I've done it for so long and so intensely. And then, our children arrived, and I was fortunate enough to be able to work in the studio on my Miami Vice and so on, and be around with my children growing up. So that to me was much more important than any live playing.
Jan, thank you so very much for taking the time out of your schedule to do this interview today. I had a great time talking to you, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
I did very much. Thank you.